Hello, everyone. My name is Simone Musa. I am a partner and member of the Management Committee of Trent Watanabe. And I have the pleasure to welcome you all to our 10th Annual International Conference for Multinationals. So this conference is directed to Brazilian companies doing business abroad, so doing business globally, and also for foreign multinationals who have relevant businesses in Brazil and in Latin America. We have invited for this year's conference industry and practice group leaders from the Brazilian market and also in international market. We have more than 50% of our speakers and also a good number in our audience coming from outside of Brazil. And for this reason, we are holding the entire conference in the English language. Nonetheless, you have the questions and answers tool. We are happy to respond questions, and you may ask those questions in Portuguese. We will have Brazilian moderators in all panels in our conference, so just feel free to ask in Portuguese. We can also respond in the Q&A or verbally after we end each panel. So we are also launching today for our clients and friends the new model that is guiding us to assist our clients navigating the legal and business aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we call the 3 R's. And the 3 R's stand for resilience, recovery, and renewal. We are aware that most of our organizations around the globe will go through these 3 phases during the pandemic. Even though the phases themselves may not be linear, they may recur or they may overlap, particularly for those organizations operating globally, because you may be in a lockdown in one market and you may be relaunching operations in another, whereas in a third market, you may be already evolving your business model, restructuring your supply chain. But important is that our practitioners are organized in multidisciplinary teams supported with industry expertise, so around industry expertise to think, to anticipate and to resolve issues in a more holistic legal manner. So just as a way of example, some of the service lines in each of the 3 phases. So during the resilience phase, where companies were or still are struggling to respond and to manage to the immediate crisis, teams are structured to serve our clients in developing workforce strategies, strengthening data privacy and cybersecurity, manage contract obligations, access tax impacts, take into account governmental subsidies that may be available around the globe, manage supply chain disruptions, consider restructuring or insolvency options, manage impact of closures, and accelerate digitalization. Then comes the recovery phase, which is a transition from the emergency response to the stable operations. And in this phase, multidisciplinary teams will address the reopen and return to work, the need to rebuild supply chains, restructure real estate, make distressed assets divestments or investments, renew compliance plans, deter disputes and others. And then finally comes the renewal phase, when companies are evolving or will evolve their operations and their business models. And then multidisciplinary teams will be prepared to assist transition into a future work model with solvency solutions to transform and strengthen supply chains, plan for digital transformation, strengthen sustainability strategies, among others. So with 60 years operating in Brazil and in the international market, we are also aware that our business needs to evolve. And the value added to our clients will be enhanced to the extent that we can provide multidisciplinary teams that understand the industry, that understand also the phase in which the industry and the particular client stands within these 3 R's, and can then anticipate and resolve issues in a more in a way that work and is efficient from a business and legal perspective. So that's what is our new model of the 3 R's. We hope that will be of service to you and that we'll be able to add more value to your organization. You can, of course, read more about this approach in our website. So now back to the conference. You'll note that most of our panels during this conference are multidisciplinary. So we have we will have not only speakers from around the globe, but we will also have speakers from different areas of law discussing a common topic. So that's much in line with our new cross-practice approach. And there are a few exceptions, of course. One exception relates to the very technical international tax panels that we have in this conference. For those of you who have participated in our conference in the past, to know that this conference is very strong on international taxation. And I would like then to let you know that our tax group is today at this conference launching their ebook on current topics and trends in international taxation. So some of the articles of our ebook will be discussed in this conference, as is the case of international tax aspects of the digital economy, of transfer pricing, certain aspects of the Brazilian tax reform, but some other topics are only included in the ebook. So we hope you will have access to that. You can download the ebook in our website, and it will also be available in the Kindle and Amazon platforms at no cost. So as many of you already know, I am actually a tax partner by experience for more than 25 years. During my career, I was the chair of the Latin America and the global tax practices of Baker McKenzie. And just to give you what is the brief overview of what is important today for companies either operating in Brazil or for Brazilian companies operating abroad, I have to say that during this career, I was very much inserted into the international tax scenario and looking at seeing what was happening in terms of developments of the international tax systems around the globe. And I can say I was sad to see how behind was Brazil. And Brazil was behind not only in the development of its tax system, but Brazil was behind not only of the developed countries, but also behind of our neighbors in Latin America. We see today countries like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and now Colombia already ascending to the OECD, actually already at the OECD, with their legislation developed to conform to international standards. And Brazil was always fighting against it and actually wanting to have its own, let's say, alien in terms of legislation, a very complex and inefficient tax legislation when compared to international parameters. And I am very proud to say that actually this year, there is a momentum, a very special, and in my view, a historic moment for Brazil in the tax arena, where we see the population together with the executive and legislative body looking at the same endpoint, which is the need to implement a major and structural tax reform. And we have to be scholars, the revenue department, intelligent people in all those bodies thinking about and trying to find a convergence point and a final end point that we can see implement with respect to the tax reform. And what should we expect? We should expect a new system that will bring a straightforward and less complex value-added tax system. So one way or another, there are several projects under analysis, but all of them lead to this endpoint, which is a straightforward, less complex and unified value-added tax system. We should also see approved, if not this year, within the next 12 months, new legislation on transfer pricing. The OECD and the Revenue Department are working together and actually consulting the population to bring up a new legislation on transfer pricing that will conform to international standards. And that's a very important requisite for Brazil to ascend to the OECD. We should also see Brazil lowering its corporate income tax and imposing dividend taxation, which is in conformation also with international standards, especially after the United States tax reform. And finally, and hopefully, we may see a reduction of the taxes applicable on employment, probably with imposition of another taxation that will make up for this revenue, probably on the financial revenues. This is on the financial transactions, and this is still the most polemic aspects that we see today. But the fact is that if the leadership in Brazil is able to implement this structural tax reform, that is today the aspect that is most and a first point of discussion at the executive and legislative bodies, we should see in Brazil a much better environment for investments, a much better business environment. And we may see Brazil ready from a tax perspective to ascend to the OECD. So we will discuss this topic tomorrow. I'm moderating a panel on the tax reforms actually around the globe and how countries adapted to the OECD and to the international environment that we have today, and other topics that will also touch on this particular aspect of the Brazilian reforms. So having said that, let me introduce my colleagues who will speak next. First, starting with Alissa Oberger. Alissa is the Global Chair of the Consumer Goods and Retail Industry Group of Baker McKenzie, and she's going to talk to us about the hot topics and trends associated with the CG&R industry. We will then pass the word to Peter George. Peter George is a partner with the Information Technology and Intellectual Property Group of Baker McKenzie. He's based in Chicago, and he's also going to talk to us about trends and developments in the IT industry, which is an industry that we call the industry naturally of the future. And finally, or last but not least, we will have José Roberto Martins. José Roberto is a partner and member of the Management Committee of Trent Rossi Watanabe. He's also the Latin America Chair for the Projects Group of Baker McKenzie, and he specializes on energy, mining, and infrastructure. So thank you very much. I hope you will enjoy the conference, this 2 days conference. I hope to see you in other panels during these 2 days, and I'm gonna pass now to Ali Oberger.
Thank you, Simone, for inviting me to speak today, and good morning to all of you who are joining us virtually. I'm really honored to have the privilege to speak with you today about trends in the consumer goods and retail sector, in particular, as this is the 10th anniversary of the Multinational Conference. So I know that I have very limited time, so I'm not going to go into any great detail on the trends, but I do want to touch on 4 trends that we've identified globally, which I think you'll find are relevant pretty much wherever you may operate across the globe. And also, while we've identified them within the CG&R sector, they probably also apply to other sectors as well. So Simone touched on some of them in her brief opening remarks, and I'm going to try to go into a little more data. One little thing of note, which is kind of interesting, is these are trends we had identified before COVID. And what we saw is that COVID actually amplified the trends. They didn't change them, they just amplified them. So I'm going to start out with a first trend, which we call extended enterprise. So extended enterprise, really briefly, is just meant to be the risk that CG&R companies, or any company, takes on board by virtue of sort of this complex organization of third parties they have across their supply chain. So what I call cradle to grave. So you've got a myriad of third parties all across this process, whether you want to talk about R&D, or if you want to talk about transportation or manufacturing or logistics, or even HR providers, and ultimately the end consumer. As you can tell, when you start mapping an extended enterprise, you end up with a constellation, if we want to talk about stars, or maybe a spider web if we want to talk about less pleasant things. But you basically have a lot going on. And on the positive side, your extended enterprise is really something that allows businesses to achieve greater efficiency, right? They can do a lot by engaging with third parties. They can also really transform business models to be more quickly nimble and able to adjust to consumer demand, which is just always evolving. So that's the positive side. On the less positive side, and I think what we really saw during the COVID crisis, is that companies don't always have a really good grasp on all of those third parties. And if you look particularly in a disruptive situation like COVID, you saw a lot of companies needing to be switching to new third parties, adding in new third parties, switching out for other ones, diversifying where their supply chain was, all in response to consumer demand. And obviously, the more complicated the constellation or the spider web, the more risk. So in particular, when you're dealing with times of disruption, you can have a significant impact on your financial and operational performance, your shareholder value, your employee engagement, and your corporate reputation generally, and ultimately, and I think where it comes back to us in our sector, consumer confidence. So I think what's really important is as consumers are, and the consumer goods and retail sector is moving towards renewal, so sort of the post-COVID world, they really need to regain control over their supply chain. And I think you're going to be hearing a lot about this. It's not only to reduce third-party risk, that's one key aspect, but it's also because supply chains need to be diversified. They have to be able to be nimble. They have to be able to adjust to ever-changing and disruptive environments. So while I think we all know that we don't want another COVID, we all know that we will likely have another disruption of some sort. And so companies need to really be thinking about the best practices that they should be putting in place so that they can handle those disruptions and not have a complete meltdown in terms of their operations. So what I'd like to do is share with you some hopefully practical tips about what you can do to get your head around the extended enterprise. First of all, make sure you know who all the third parties are. That sounds really basic, but you really need to know who they are and what kind of contract you have in place with them. If you don't know, do an audit. It's not that difficult. It's a little time consuming, but take a good hard look at your supply chain, identify it from cradle to grave, everybody involved, and what kind of contracts you have in place with them. The second thing, and again, seems obvious, but might not be obvious, create a really robust code of conduct, something that really sets out what you stand for as a company and what you expect from every third party you do business with. You, of course, expect them to behave in a responsible and ethical manner, but you also expect them to comply with law, health and safety requirements, non-discrimination, no child labor laws, etc. And more importantly than that, include that code of conduct in your contract. So make reference to it. Include some really robust compliance covenants in your contracts for everything related to third parties, but in particular when you're dealing with sourcing type agreements. So make sure that you're also describing not only what is expected, but what is prohibited. And then one, again, maybe obvious, but make sure that you've got audit rights in your contract and termination rights for non-compliance. And more importantly, be unafraid to enforce them. So if you think you don't know what's going on, make sure you know what's going on and make sure you have a contract that allows you to do that. And then last, and this again is one that I think can make a really concrete difference in your business operations, train your employees. Help them understand just how risky business can be and why it's not something to be taken lightly and why it's not just something that we post up on our wall and say we have a strong code of conduct. It's something you need to live and breathe. So for the teams that are working on finding and the sourcing teams, the procurement teams, they need to understand what sort of due diligence they need to be doing and what sort of consequences can arise if they're not properly doing that. So that's one team, but there's also the contract negotiation team. And I always like to bring this up because back in my in-house days, I used to do this little contract training. People need to know, the people out there negotiating contracts need to know where they can't give. Like what are the no-go, can't compromise clauses? And I think when you're dealing with risk, these are really important clauses to hit home with the sales team and the business teams who are negotiating agreements. So I'm going to leave it at there for extended enterprise and move on to trend 2, even though I should probably just leave this all together to Peter, who's much more knowledgeable than me. Digital transformation. Again, something we were hearing a lot about pre-COVID. We heard a lot about the omnichannel environment, how to make sure the customer experience was seamless from online to offline, from offline to online, how you could use consumer data to make the experience more personal. And then COVID happened and the pandemic just put like turbocharge on this whole digital transformation. So what we saw were individuals like our parents or grandparents were suddenly going online because they had nowhere else to go when they needed to buy things. And people that were already pretty comfortable online were moving into new product categories. So they were expanding the way they were functioning online. And I think one of the things that data has proven is that there is a significant part of consumer spend that's going to remain online even post-COVID. So in other words, consumer behavior will not go back to how it was before. But what all that means is with all this increased activity, we've got increased data because it's all about making the experience valuable, personal, as if you were in a store. And that means you're managing data, you need to be careful with that data, and you need to be using it in ways that are intelligent. So you may see things in the M&A space around acquiring customer lists, acquiring customer data. You may also see new types of technology that help you process that data and use it in a way that appeals to your customers. So again, I'm going to try to highlight very high level, and Peter's probably got more to say on this, but when you're looking at going online, I think point one is look at the kind of model you want. Do you want a model that's your own direct e-commerce site, your own online site? Do you want to go through an online retailer like a department store, or do you want to go onto a marketplace model where you maintain seller of record, but you're on a third-party platform like eBay? I think what you need to look at when you're looking at the various models is how much control you're going to have over things like display and advertising of product, and of course how that data is being managed, because it all comes back to the data, and you want to make sure that ultimately people see you as the brand. So whatever happens to their data, you're going to be the one that they're coming to. And then once you've done that, the second thing is probably, in particular, if you're looking at expansion into new jurisdictions, is again conducting due diligence. And when I say due diligence in this sense, I mean make sure that your online purchase actually makes it to the customer. There's a lot that needs to go into delivery across borders. There are costs associated, there are regulatory hurdles, there's a lot that goes into that movement from A to B. So it's essential that the experience results in the customer receiving the product. Otherwise, I think you're going to have a lot of brand reputation issues and some pretty disastrous consumer consequences. And then finally, just one last word, don't forget the basics of data protection. So I'm going to leave it at that. You need to make sure your policies are in place, you need to make sure they're transparent, and you need to make sure that you're not losing sight of data protection laws. Very quickly moving on to trend 3, another one that we heard from Simone, restructuring and insolvency. So two things happening here, and particularly in CG&R, really heavy hit, probably the sector the most impacted by COVID, whether it's retail, fashion, or hospitality. The downside is lots of bankruptcies. I mean, we had already heard about the retail apocalypse, the death of brick and mortar. Now we actually are seeing those bankruptcies happening. If I wanted to be an optimist, I'd say with every cloud has a silver lining. The silver lining is there are fantastic opportunities for companies with strong balance sheets. There are amazing assets out there, whether if we could be talking about tech assets, tech talent, we can be talking about customer data, we can be talking about filling in gaps to your supply chain, to your product offering. There will be opportunities out there. So if I take a look at the legal issues around that, if you want to look at, and I'm going to harken back to the extended enterprise, there's risk involved. So the things that companies need to be thinking about is, have they played out risk scenarios? How are they dealing with board oversight? How are they documenting what they're doing to future-proof, risk-proof the business? That's really important, because when a company starts to go bad, that's where people are going to be coming back. And consumer activism, I mean, consumers are becoming more and more activist, and they're not going to ignore the bankruptcy space. So there will likely be consumer activism if they feel that management was negligent and didn't really behave in a proper manner in light of the pandemic risks. And then I guess just to talk really briefly on the M&A side, and I am an M&A lawyer, so I have to get that in there. If you're buying a distressed asset, you obviously can't do due diligence the way you normally would, right? So you might want to look at acquisition strategies that are more cherry picking of assets, not taking on unknowns, not knowing what you're getting into. So one thing to consider is buying just the things that are key to you. Having said that, and I always have the flip side, bankruptcy judges don't necessarily appreciate cherry picking. So what a bankruptcy judge will often be looking at is who's the bidder who can keep the business together, preserve employment, preserve contractual relationships, not terminate all store locations. So I think as a potential bidder, you really need to weigh those two out and try to figure out how you want to place your bid, because assets may be interesting, but they might not be the most effective way to actually get the asset. And I know that I'm over time, so I'm going to give you one last word on my last trend, and it's one that I will be joining a panel tomorrow, so you'll hear more from me then, is sustainability. So just 2 words on sustainability. We were already seeing a consumer that was very prepared to use the power of the pocketbook, as I like to put it, to stand behind brands that they valued the same values and had the same ethics, and to boycott or call out brands that were not performing ethically. That has only gotten more vocal since COVID took over. And so whereas I think some companies may think this is the time to skimp and maybe put resources elsewhere, that's not the good business strategy. The good business strategy is to maintain your sustainability efforts. One phrase, you can't just talk the talk, you need to walk the walk. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter George, IP Tech from Chicago, to take us through digital.
Thank you, Ali. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Paris. My name is Peter George. I'm a partner in the Information Technology and Intellectual Property Practice Group at Baker McKenzie. And I'm one of the co-leads of our Technology Transactions business unit. And really appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit about what we're seeing clients doing with respect to digital transformation, especially as we enter the renewal phase. Initially it was very interesting. We would get lots of inquiries from our clients about, how do we deal with the disruptions, as Ali mentioned, things like the supply chain as a result of the pandemic. A lot of that work was focused on understanding what was in contracts, and it was very interesting, Ali, that many clients didn't even had a hard time finding the contracts that they had with some of these suppliers, much less understanding, what the force majeure clause says and things like that. We're now moving into this renewal phase, and my practice really is focused on helping clients to take advantage of digital tools and technologies. Digital transformation is essentially just taking these new tools and implementing them in ways that help to either augment or replace legacy business processes. And sort of moving forward from Ali's theme, one area where we're seeing lots of use of digital transformation today is in the sourcing space. And some of it's, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's very fundamental in a pandemic, when you have travel restrictions, when you have requirements for social distancing, when you have work from home orders here in Chicago. We've been working from home for a long time. It raises questions. How do we even contract, right, with our supply chain partners? We can't physically be in the same room with them. And so a lot of the questions that we've gotten, at least during the recovery phase, were around electronic contracting. And what is the requirement under law in all the jurisdictions where companies do business to have binding and enforceable contracts that are formed electronically? What's interesting is that, and it's the interesting thing about working at an international law firm, is that while there's some general harmony across, most jurisdictions, the rules can change and vary, and sometimes the enforceability of your contract depends, even on what the contract is for. What is the subject matter of that agreement? In some cases, you're going to have to, have special processes in place to make sure that you have a binding contract for those particular goods and services. But even more than that is the question of what do you need to have and what processes do you have to have in place with respect to electronic contracting to facilitate the enforceability of that contract by a local court. And that's where I think, especially companies that are first starting out on this digital transformation process, it can be really helpful to evaluate what are those risks and understand, for a particular jurisdiction, how do I need to evidence my contracts with my supply chain partners so that I can be comfortable that if there's an issue, I can seek relief in a local court and I'll be able to get that. In addition to electronic contracting, and Ali, again, it goes sort of on your theme of understanding your supply chain and who your supply chain partners are. One area where we've been working a lot with clients is implementing what you call a digital platform, which is basically a technology that allows you to see visually and to track all your supply chain partners so that when you do your audit, you have a repository to locate that information. The interesting thing about these digital platforms, while they, I think, very much do help our clients as they go through the recovery phase and into the renewal phase, understand, you know, what their footprint, what the footprint of their extended enterprise looks like. They generate a tremendous amount of data and information. And sometimes that information can be customer facing. So understanding, you know, what are your distributors selling your products? What are the prices that they're selling to the customers? Understanding what are the prices at which you're buying inputs from your supply chain partners. And this creates lots and lots of information, lots of tools and technologies out there to help clients manage and interpret that information and take advantage of what they're learning from that technology, from that information. But it comes with some risks, right? If you know what your distributors are selling your products, the prices that they're selling to the customers, you got to think about who should have access to that information and how's that information going to be used. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is helping our clients construct what they're almost sort of like information use policies and access policies. And traditionally, I think we think of data policies as sort of customer-facing policies where an enterprise might tell a consumer, you know, here's how we're going to use your data, here's what we'll do with it, here's what we won't do with it, so that the consumers can be comfortable sharing that information with the enterprise. Now these data usage policies are increasingly internally focused, and they're you know, setting out the parameters, you know, who can access that information, who can't access that information. Do you really want your regional sales managers to know the prices that your distributors are selling to the customers, or is that information that really they shouldn't have because from an antitrust perspective, we don't even want them with access to that information? So these are areas where I think looking at digital transformation is really important to understand what are the legal risks that we have to, even just identify, and then to think about how we're going to implement policies to address those types of risks. So that's one area where we're seeing, you know, really an acceleration of the use of digital tools to help enterprises move from the recovery phase into the renewal phase. Another area of digital transformation is not quite as attention grabbing, but I think it's where there's even more of an emphasis is on back office tools and technologies, and maybe principally migration from sort of on-premises or co-located data centers where computing processing is basically purchased as a product, to cloud-based infrastructure where your computing resources are purchased as a service. And what you're essentially doing is you're transforming this like fixed capital investment in computing technology into a variable service-based offering. And it can be really attractive to lots of enterprises. It's a very efficient way to structure your investment in computer resources and things like that. And it's increasingly important because there is so much data that's being generated. It requires lots of computing power to manage all that information. But transferring control over that information to a third-party cloud service provider raises a whole host of issues itself. And what's really interesting, especially for multinational companies who are looking at maybe migrating or centralizing from distributed on-premises computing centers or data centers to third-party public or private clouds, is the fact that that information, they lose a little bit of control over where it physically resides, because, you know, even in the cloud, that information has to reside somewhere. And you're transforming your footprint from a data perspective, understanding where that information goes is really important, because one, increasingly jurisdictions are regulating where that information should be. We're helping lots of clients deal with data sovereignty laws, which are basically laws, governments mandate that information, certain types of information, has to physically reside within a particular jurisdiction. If you're migrating to a cloud, especially a cloud that's going to be operated by a third party, understanding where that third party's cloud physically sits is critical to compliance with those data sovereignty laws. Likewise, where your information resides, and this has been the case forever, really, but understanding where that information goes may or may not trigger local compliance laws because that information now sits in a particular jurisdiction. And so one area where we've been helping lots of companies, especially South American companies, is if they decide to work with a cloud service provider that maybe doesn't have a data center in their jurisdiction, understanding what are the implications now of migrating my data center from Brazil, say, to Miami. And now I have data that physically resides on servers in Miami. What does that mean? You know, does the US government now have unfettered rights to access that data information? Is that information now subject to US export controls where maybe it wasn't in the past? So, I mean, understanding, you know, what are the legal implications of your digital transformation, I think critically important. And then maybe I'll finish, Ali, with just a few words about what we call data monetization. It's really the use of all this information and data that's generated, collected, analyzed about consumers, and especially e-commerce and the purchase of goods and services and the marketing of goods and services to electronic consumers, consumers over the internet. There is increasingly, and there will continue to be, regulation around how information that is collected from consumers is used. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we would have said, well, what's really important is that whatever you're telling these consumers you're going to do with their data, what's really important is that you comply with what you're saying to the consumer, right? You're making promises to people. You have to comply with those promises. The government stepped in now, and around the world, governments are saying, well, actually, there are some minimum standards, right, that we're going to require, we're going to say, have to apply to this information and how you protect this information and what your responsibilities are if this information is compromised or if there's a data breach incident. And so it increasingly is important for enterprises to understand what are those commitments, because they might be different from what you've put in your contract with your consumer or in your privacy policy. So increasingly, that's an area of focus. That information incredibly valuable. A lot of the digital transformation tools that we're helping clients work with right now are ways to analyze and interpret that information. And there's a lot of benefit to that. And there's lots that can be done in a legally compliant fashion, but I think it's critical, especially for a multinational enterprise that has consumers maybe all over the world who are now buying direct from the multinational through like an online platform, for example. Understanding what you can and can't do with that information. And it'd be great to dive into that in more detail, but I think we'll have to leave that for the next time because I think I'm probably close to using up my time here. And with that, I will turn things over to Roberto.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And good morning, everyone. Our dear clients, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, actually, wherever you may be. This is my 10th attendance to the multinational conferences. This is unique from everything I had before, but I'm sure that we will have a great conference this year from what I'm just hearing from the other speakers. I have the challenge of bring to you my personal view about trends and investments in the energy, mining, and infrastructure area. Here at Bakers, we use an acronym for this. We call it EMI, so bear with me with this acronym. As a lawyer, I have been working in this area for over 20 years. And so with all this experience, I idea of what will happen in the following months. But the fact is that in crises like that, it's really difficult to anticipate trends since our capacity to read the facts sometimes is compromised. There are mixed signs every some days stock prices soar, and just to the very next day, bad news pops up again, and we are again back to square one. So to prepare something meaningful for this panel, I decided to use only two metrics. So the metric number one would be to bring you some fresh numbers of our economy, particularly in Brazil. Since I'm in Brazil, I think I could give you an angle on that. And the metrics number two, well, this is a very personal metrics. I call it the phone ring factor, which means that whenever clients call transactional lawyers, we see things getting hotter. Whenever the phone stops to ring, the economy will give a pause. So bear with me, I'll back to this other metric. So let's start with the numbers first. And let's remember of our numbers in Latin America and Brazil soon before the COVID. So back then, Latin America was experiencing record levels of foreign direct investment, of FDI. In 2019, last year, seems a century right now, but it was only last year, we had an increase of 10% over the foreign direct investment of the last year. Almost $170 billion came to the region in 2019. In Brazil, this increase was even higher. We had an increase of 20% over our FDI of last year. And this meant $72 billion coming to Brazil. This made Brazil at that time the fourth best or most favorite destination of foreign direct investment in all the world. And Brazil was, ranked among other developing, not developing, developed countries at that time. Not bad. Also, may I remember that out of the $70 billion, almost half of that came to the energy, mining, and infrastructure area. So we had divestments from Petrobras selling non-core assets. We had some privatizations. We had just a single transaction which involved the sale of a gas transportation company called TAG, THG, which was purchased for more than $8 billion by Engie, by an European company, just in this area alone. Now, let's fast forward time a little bit. So we are now in March, and COVID has just hit Latin. Latin was the last region to be hit by COVID. At that time, there was a consensus that the region would take years to recover from this hit. At that time, I'm also part of the management, as Simone said. At that time, we at the management thought, well, we better give our transaction lawyers a vacation, because how come we still have transactions amid, all this pandemic and people home working around the globe? And this, is still true, of course, and there is not any big recovery thus far. In average, the contraction of the Latin countries is still expected to be harshly impacted, even though the numbers have been improving a little bit, the forecasts have been improving a little bit. It is still expected that we have negative growth of our GDP in the region of 5%. And also, we all know that the same $170 billion in investment of last year will not come this year. But remember the phone ring factor. So it's interesting that despite all of this crisis, our clients continued to give us mandates for transactions, and mandates including in the energy, mining, and infrastructure area. Our competitor law firms are as busy as we are, so something is going on. You know, we can see the prices of commodities coming back to what they were before the COVID, some minerals as well. We had Brazil with a record of numbers of IPOs in this year, 2020. We had 3 IPOs in the first semester. 9 others are confirmed to occur this year, the second semester, and there is at least a dozen more waiting to happen, most likely next year. This is a record for Brazilian standards. So how to explain this phone ring factor? I mean, how to explain transactions still coming in? Well, I have 3 speculations to share with you very quickly. Speculation number 1, our fellow countries are giving us a good hand. We are the last, remember, we were the last region to be hit. This means that other countries are not in the first R of the 3 Rs. Our other countries are going, you know, are moving to the recovery and the renewal phases, while Latin is still defending its business, so to say. And in these other countries, take the G20, the richest countries in the world, they injected $5 trillion in their own markets. This means 5 Brazilian GDPs, $5 trillion. The US Fed and the European Central Bank alone injected almost $3 trillion in their economies. Well, this is helping these countries to recover even faster. And these countries are demanding commodities, and these countries are will probably behind all these commodity prices recovery. Our fellow partner, China. China is today the best partner of the Latin countries. The production levels are almost the same as before the crisis. China's appetite for investment is not dormant. Just last month, our office here in Brazil assisted a major Chinese company entering into a $5 billion investment in greenfield thermoelectric power plants. Go figure. I mean, this deal has been cut amid the COVID. As Peter said, I mean, we experienced this electronic signing of all the contracts, and everything was negotiated by video, including China and Brazil. This is amazing. So speculation number 2 for the phone keeps ringing. Our economy is giving signs of life. Yes, the patient is alive. So the public spending in Brazil is a public disaster, as everybody knows. It couldn't be different, I guess. But there are some good metrics to celebrate. Last month, Brazil opened 130,000 new jobs. This is something that hadn't happened since February. Our inflation rates are tamed now. The interest rates are in record lowest levels, and our trade balance is fine. We are exporting a lot with a favorable foreign exchange rate. So our economy is giving signs. And the last speculation for this recovery may be faster than we also expected, is that actually money has not disappeared at all. It's just moving places. So the economy keeps active somehow. And there is where I will introduce my trends for DMI very quickly. We are short of time. So what are the industries we see in MI that continue to be hot or will get hotter after the COVID situation gets better? Well, starting with privatizations, as I mentioned, last year privatizations accounted for a big chunk of foreign investments. Of course, the program has been impacted this year. The Ministry of Economy, the Super Ministry of Economy in Brazil, has just announced that it intends to do at least 4 privatizations this year. This would include Eletrobras, our postal service, the Correios, our main port, Port of Santos, and an oil and gas company, PPSA. If you ask me, I'm not sure he will be up to his promise because we have regulations, approvals. But anyway, if this doesn't happen still in 2020, this will gonna happen next year for one simple reason. The government needs desperately funds to balance its trade, and most of these studies for the privatizations are already prepared. So I believe that sooner or later, maybe next year, we'll have assets being sold with the potential not only to raise funds for the government, but also to inject some efficiency in our public services. The other trend, renewable energy. This is booming. This is booming. And it's booming for one specific question, one specific factor. This is cheaper. This is cheaper than conventional energy. You look at the utilities today, the traditional conventional energy, the way I consume energy, these utilities are heavily indebted. And after COVID, this will only get worse. Sooner or later, all this debt will be passed over to the tariffs, to the energy prices. So the consumers are already looking actually at cheaper options. And voila, there is the renewable energy. Energy that is green, yes, it is sustainable, perfect, it's sexy, it's democratic and affordable. So every company, small companies or residents will have a solution that fits their needs. So I was listening to Ali, renewable energy is becoming very soon, a consumer good as any other household item. So if your company has not yet received a call from a seller of electric energy, this will happen very soon. If you don't know much about renewable energy, catch up and stay tuned, because this is a reality in our country. While renewable energy is already a reality, sanitation is a good promise. In Brazil, only half of our population get access to treated sewage. This means that 100 million people do not have yet treatment of their sewage. This puts Brazil in the 19th century. Brazil has just approved a new law that should boost sanitation and the whole industry around that. So this would be one last speculation. And I think so much for speculations, right? They may be, we don't know how much this will gonna actually happen. But we know for sure that this EMI market will be certainly driven by technology and sustainability, as the examples I gave you. They will play an important role in our industry. ESG is also very important for our industry. And this is the basis, has been the basis of our economy for decades. So if Brazil recovers, the EMI industry will be one of the first to recover. So having said that, and to conclude my remarks very quickly, regardless of the industry you may come from, perhaps we may see EMI markets recovering faster than anticipated, a new market driven by technology, as I say. And no matter how your company has been affected or benefited from the crisis, I think we have today a varied menu of legal market information for you, reforms, trends, new visions. We brought 40 great lawyers, not only from Brazil, from many countries. They will give you practical and pragmatical solutions for your business. I hope you enjoy it. So soon after this session ends, use your links. I register for some of these panels, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I do. So thank you very much. And Simone, back to you. I don't know if there are questions to answer.
Actually, not in the Q&A, so we don't have questions in the Q&A particularly. But let me see the time. We have 5 minutes. Perhaps I could ask a question that I have, perhaps to Peter. Whether we are seeing clients changing their contract terms in light of the COVID, and if so, what we have learned from it, and how we move forward to renewal.
Oh, great. Well, that's a great question, Simone. Definitely. I think one of the, you have to learn from from experience, right? And so even going back to Ali's original comments about even understanding who your supply chain partners are and being able to find those contracts, understanding what's in them is critical. And definitely there's been a focus on force majeure or disaster clauses. What happens? Are you relieved from liability if something beyond control happens? And opposite, are you protected? It looks like my internet's a bit unstable right now. But in addition to that, we've been helping clients consider changes to their audit clauses, for example, because when you can't travel, you can't physically go and audit a supplier who's not located in the same state or same country where you live. So looking at use of technology and maybe updating your audit clause to allow for different types of devices or monitoring tools to be implemented into your supplier's manufacturing facility, for example, so that you can audit inventories remotely. I mean, those are things that typically, if you looked at your audit clauses in traditional contract, you wouldn't see any right to do things like that. And so those are, examples where I think now looking back at, what are the consequences of a pandemic? What does it do? How does it affect the supply chain? We've been working with our clients, to help them figure out and think about how they might change those contracts going forward so that they're better prepared for the next time. So it's a fantastic question.
Simone, if I can add to what Peter just said, we asked our EMI clients, what is the risk that you fear more? And it's interesting that these clients are usually traditional clients, right? Traditional economy. They said cyber security. That's interesting. That just fits into what Peter said. They operate remotely most of their facilities, and they are not perhaps so used to cyber security issues and attacks.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists and to the audience. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference during these 2 days. With that, I think we have gained 2 minutes so we can transition to the next panels. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy.
Enjoy the day.